The scream did not come from Alira. It came from somewhere deep inside her chest, trapped, silent, because if she screamed out loud, they would catch her before she reached the king's chamber. Her bare feet slapped against the cold stone floor of the east corridor, and her heart pounded so hard she thought it might give her away before her footsteps did. Somewhere behind her, a door had opened. Somewhere ahead, a man who did not know he was dying was sleeping peacefully, trusting the people he should not have trusted at all. 3 weeks earlier, Alira had walked through the front gates of Draven Hollow with nothing but a small bag and a letter of recommendation from a pack elder who barely remembered her name. She was 24 years old, plain in dress, sharp in mind, and utterly unremarkable to anyone who did not look twice. That was exactly how she liked it. In her old pack, being noticed had never brought her anything good. Here, in the grand estate of Alpha King Draven, she hoped to disappear into the walls, earn her wages, and send money home to her younger brother, who was studying to become a healer in the Southern Territories. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Odette, looked her over once and decided she would do. Maids were not hard to find, but reliable ones who did not gossip were rare, and Alira had the quiet look of someone who kept her thoughts to herself. She was assigned to the private wing, the most sensitive part of the estate, where the king slept, where his advisors met, and where very few servants were ever allowed to go without supervision. Alira had never seen an Alpha King up close before. In her village, the pack leaders were ordinary men who worked the fields alongside everyone else. Here, everything was different. The estate was built of pale stone and dark wood, with high windows that let in slanted afternoon light, and every hallway smelled faintly of cedar and old parchment. Guards stood at every major junction, silent and watchful, their eyes following her as she carried linens from room to room. She caught her first real glimpse of King Draven on her second day. He was crossing the central courtyard with 2 of his council members, and even from a distance, there was something different about him. He walked like a man carrying the weight of an entire territory on his shoulders, yet he did not stoop under it. His hair was dark, his jaw set firm, and though he was speaking calmly to the men beside him, Alira noticed something the others seemed to miss. His eyes kept moving, scanning the courtyard, checking the shadows. A king who trusted no one completely, not even in his own home. She thought nothing more of it at the time. She had work to do, and an Alpha King's private worries were none of her business, or so she told herself. It was on her 5th night, while dusting the shelves of the small study just outside the council chamber, that she first heard the voices. The study connected to the main meeting room, through a narrow servants' passage, one of the many hidden corridors built into the old estate, so that staff could move without being seen. Alira had been told never to use it while meetings were in session, but she had not realized one was happening that evening, and by the time she heard the voices, she was already standing frozen in the dark passage, duster still in hand. 2 men were speaking, low and careful, the way people speak when they do not want to be overheard even by their own allies. She recognized one voice as belonging to Councilman Halden, a tall, silver-haired man who oversaw the estate's finances. The second voice she did not know, but it was rough and impatient. "Everything must be finished before the next full moon," the rough voice said. "He cannot be at full strength when the gathering happens. If he stands before the other packs at full power, our plan falls apart before it even begins." "The dosage is already working," Halden replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "He grows weaker every week. No one suspects, because the physician reports only exhaustion, nothing more. By the time anyone realizes what is happening, it will be too late to reverse it." Alira did not understand every word, but she understood enough. Something was being done to the king, something secret, something that was making him weaker on purpose. Her hands trembled so badly that the duster nearly slipped from her fingers, and she pressed herself against the cold stone wall, terrified that even her breathing might betray her. She did not move again until the voices faded and footsteps retreated from the council chamber. Only then did she creep back through the passage, her mind spinning with what she had heard. She told herself it might be nothing. Perhaps they were discussing a trade dispute, or a difficult decision about taxes, and she had simply misunderstood. But the word dosage stayed lodged in her mind, like a splinter she could not remove. The next morning, she found Odette in the linen room, and, choosing her words carefully, mentioned that she had heard something strange near the council chamber the night before. Odette did not even look up from the sheets she was folding. You are a maid, child, not a spy, Odette said flatly. Whatever business happens in that chamber is not for us to hear, and certainly not for us to repeat. If you value your position here, you will forget whatever you think you heard. Elira wanted to argue, but she knew better. She was new, unproven, and easily replaced. Speaking further would only mark her as a troublemaker, and troublemakers did not last long in grand estates like this one. So she swallowed her fear and returned to her duties, though the unease never fully left her. Over the following days, Elira began to watch the king more closely, not out of duty, but out of a growing sense that something truly was wrong. She noticed that he ate less at the evening meals than he used to, according to the whispers among the kitchen staff. She noticed that his walk, once strong and certain, had grown slightly heavier, as though his limbs carried more weight than before. She noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes, circles that no amount of rest seemed to erase. Most people around him did not seem to notice at all, or if they did, they attributed it to the burdens of leadership. An alpha king had many responsibilities after all. It was easy to explain away exhaustion as simply part of the job, but Elira had heard those two voices in the passage, and she could not unhear them. Every small sign of weakness in the king now felt like evidence of something far more sinister than overwork. She began paying closer attention to the kitchen as well, though she had no real reason to be there beyond her usual duties of carrying trays and collecting dishes. She noticed that a new steward, a quiet man named Garrick, had recently taken charge of preparing the king's private meals, replacing an older cook who had served the family for over a decade. When Elira asked one of the kitchen girls what had happened to the old cook, the girl shrugged and said only that he had retired suddenly, without much explanation, and Garrick had been hired within days to take his place. It could mean nothing. Cooks retired all the time. Yet combined with everything else, it felt like one more piece of a puzzle Elira could not yet see the full shape of. She decided, against every instinct of self-preservation, that she needed more information before she could go to anyone with real authority. Words without proof would only get her dismissed, or worse, branded as a liar spreading dangerous rumors about the king's council. She needed something solid, something undeniable. That evening, as she cleared the dinner trays from the private dining hall, she lingered a moment longer than necessary near the king's chair. Up close, she could see it clearly now, the faint tremor in his hand, as he set down his cup, quickly hidden the moment he noticed her watching. Their eyes met for just a second. His were tired, but sharp, assessing her the way a leader assesses everyone, searching for threat or loyalty in equal measure. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice deep but not unkind. "No, my king," she said quickly, lowering her eyes and gathering the tray. "Nothing at all." She left the hall with her pulse racing, certain that he had seen something in her expression, some flicker of the fear and suspicion she carried. But he said nothing more, and she was not called back or questioned. Still, the encounter left her shaken. She was getting too close to something dangerous, and she knew it. That night, lying awake in the small servants' quarters she shared with two other maids, Elira turned the pieces over and over in her mind. The overheard conversation, the king's growing weakness, the sudden change in kitchen staff. Each piece alone might mean nothing. Together, they formed a picture she did not want to believe, yet could not ignore. She thought of her brother, studying to become a healer, and how he always told her that sickness rarely appeared all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as fatigue, as stress, as simple bad luck, until suddenly it was too advanced to stop. What if someone understood that same principle, and was using it deliberately? What if someone wanted the king to grow weak, so gradually, that no one would notice until it was far too late? The full moon gathering the rough-voiced man had mentioned was still weeks away. That gave her time, she told herself. Time to watch, time to learn, time to find proof strong enough that even a king's most trusted advisors could not dismiss it. She did not sleep well that night. Every creak of the old estate's wooden beams made her flinch. Every distant footstep in the hallway outside sent her heart racing. She had come to Draven Hollow hoping to disappear into the background of a grand household, to work quietly and send her wages home. Instead, she found herself carrying a secret so heavy it felt as though it might crush her entirely. By the time dawn light crept through the small window of her room, Elira had made a decision. She would not go to Odette again. She would not go to the guards, who might report directly to the very men she suspected. Instead, she would watch, and wait, and gather whatever evidence she could, no matter how small, until she had enough to bring the truth directly to someone who could not ignore it. She rose from her narrow bed, dressed in her plain gray uniform, and tied back her dark hair with steady hands, though her stomach still churned with fear. Whatever was happening within the walls of Draven Hollow, she was now a part of it, whether she wanted to be or not. And somewhere beneath her fear, a quiet, stubborn resolve was beginning to take root. She could not undo what she had heard. She could not pretend she had not noticed the king's trembling hands, or his growing exhaustion. All she could do now was find the truth, and pray she found it before it was too late to matter. As she stepped out into the corridor to begin her morning duties, she passed by the council chamber, its heavy doors closed and silent. Somewhere behind them, decisions were being made, plans continuing to unfold, threads of a conspiracy tightening around a man who trusted the wrong people. Illyra paused for only a moment, staring at those closed doors, before forcing herself to walk on. She had work to do. And now, whether she liked it or not, she had a mission far more important than dusting shelves or folding linens. She had a king to save, even if he did not yet know he needed saving, and even if no one around her believed a simple maid could possibly know anything worth hearing. The days that followed felt longer than any she had known before. Every glance from Councilman Halden sent a jolt of fear through her chest. Every quiet word between Garrick the steward and his kitchen helpers made her strain to listen without appearing to. She began arriving early to her duties, and leaving late, using the extra time to move quietly through corridors she had every right to be in, watching, memorizing, waiting for the smallest detail that might crack the conspiracy wide open. She thought often of simply leaving, of packing her small bag, and returning home, where things were simple and safe. But every time the thought crossed her mind, she remembered the tremor in the king's hand, the tiredness behind his sharp eyes, and the cold certainty in Halden's voice as he spoke of dosages and full moons. She could not walk away from a man's life, not when she might be the only person in the entire estate who understood the danger he was in. Illyra did not know it yet, but the choice she made in that quiet corridor, to stay, to watch, to fight for a truth no one wanted to hear, would soon place her directly in the path of the very people trying to destroy the Alpha King. And once she was noticed, there would be no going back to the safe, unremarkable life she had hoped to build within these stone walls. Odette found Illyra scrubbing the same section of floor for the third time that morning, and finally set down her ledger with a sharp sigh. "Girl, you have been distracted all week. If your mind is elsewhere, take it elsewhere, and finish your chores when it returns." Illyra apologized quickly, and forced her hands to move faster, though her thoughts remained tangled in the conversation she had overheard days earlier. She had promised herself she would gather proof before speaking again, yet proof was proving far harder to find than she had expected. The kitchen had become the center of her quiet investigation, though she could not spend too much time there without raising suspicion. She was, after all, a chambermaid, not a kitchen hand, and any excuse to linger near the ovens and prep tables needed to look natural. She began volunteering to carry extra trays, to fetch spices from the pantry, to help wash dishes when the kitchen girls fell behind, always with a pleasant smile and a helpful attitude that hid the sharp attention behind her eyes. Garrick, the new steward, ran his kitchen with a tight, controlled discipline that felt different from the warm chaos Illyra remembered from her own family's home. He measured ingredients precisely, checked every dish before it left the kitchen, and rarely allowed anyone else near the king's private meals. The other kitchen staff seemed to respect him, or perhaps simply fear him a little, and none of them questioned his methods. Why would they? He was skilled, efficient, and the king had not complained of the food, only of tiredness, that everyone assumed came from the pressures of ruling. It took nearly a week before Illyra found her first real piece of evidence. She had been sent to fetch dried herbs from the estate's storage pantry, a small stone room tucked behind the kitchen, where jars and pouches lined every shelf. While searching for the correct herb, her fingers brushed against a small wooden box pushed far into the back corner of a high shelf, hidden behind larger containers of flour and grain. It seemed deliberately placed out of easy reach. Curiosity, and perhaps something stronger than curiosity, made her pull it down. Inside, wrapped in cloth, sat a collection of small glass vials, filled with a pale, grayish powder, unlike anything she recognized from ordinary cooking. There was no label, No marking of any kind, only the faint bitter smell that rose when she carefully unstoppered one vial and brought it close to her nose. It reminded her of something her brother had once described in one of his healer's letters, an old and rarely used herb blend known in certain northern territories, one capable of dulling a wolf's natural senses and strength if taken slowly over time. She could not be entirely certain, not without more knowledge than she possessed, but her instincts screamed that she had found something important. Footsteps echoed from the kitchen beyond, and Alira quickly wrapped the vials back into their cloth and returned the box to its hidden corner, her hands shaking as she smoothed her apron and grabbed a jar of ordinary dried thyme to justify her presence. Garrick appeared in the doorway a moment later, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at her. "You are far from your usual duties," he said, his tone even, though something behind his gaze felt sharp and assessing. "The head housekeeper asked me to fetch herbs for the evening stew," Alira answered, holding up the thyme with what she hoped looked like innocent confidence. Garrick studied her for a long moment before nodding and stepping aside to let her pass. She walked out of that pantry with her heart hammering so violently she feared he could hear it, and she did not stop walking until she reached the safety of the linen room upstairs, where she finally allowed herself to breathe. She spent that night turning the discovery over in her mind again and again. A hidden box of unmarked powder, kept separate from ordinary cooking supplies, deliberately placed where casual eyes would never find it. It was not proof of poisoning on its own, not enough to bring before anyone with real power, but it was more than she had before. Combined with the overheard conversation about dosages and the full moon, it painted a picture growing darker by the day. She desperately wanted to tell someone, yet every path forward seemed blocked. Odette had already dismissed her once, and would likely do so again. Perhaps even report Alira's continued suspicions as troubling behavior unfit for a maid. The guards answered to the council, the very body she now suspected of harboring a traitor. She did not know which of the king's advisors could be trusted and which could not, and guessing wrong could cost her far more than her position. It could cost her life, and perhaps the king's as well, if the wrong person learned she was getting close to the truth. There was one person, she realized with a growing sense of dread, who she had not yet considered approaching: the king himself. The thought terrified her. A lowly maid could not simply request an audience with an alpha king, and even if she somehow managed it, what would she say? That she had overheard a private conversation she was never meant to hear, and found a box of powder she could not properly identify. It sounded absurd even to her own ears. He would likely dismiss her instantly, or worse, question how she had come to overhear his counsel's private discussions in the first place, drawing dangerous attention to herself before she had gathered enough proof to matter. Still, the alternative, saying nothing and watching him grow weaker week after week, felt impossible to accept. She thought of her brother's healer training, of how he always said that hesitation in the face of illness could be the difference between recovery and tragedy. She did not know exactly what was happening to King Draven, but she knew enough to be certain that doing nothing was not an option she could live with. Over the following days, Alira changed her approach. Rather than trying to find a way to speak with the king directly, which felt increasingly impossible given the strict boundaries between staff and royalty, she focused instead on watching Garrick's kitchen even more closely, hoping to catch some clear moment of wrongdoing that could not be explained away. She noted which meals seemed to correspond most closely with the king's worst days of fatigue, quietly memorizing patterns even as she carried trays and cleared dishes with practiced, unremarkable efficiency. She noticed that certain evening meals, the ones Garrick prepared personally rather than delegating to his kitchen helpers, always seemed to precede the king's heaviest mornings, when his steps grew slow and his temper, usually calm and measured, turned short and irritable. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as coincidence, yet the pattern held firm across nearly 2 weeks of careful observation. She also began paying closer attention to Councilman Halden, watching his movements through the estate whenever her duties allowed. She noticed he met privately, and often, with the rough-voiced man from that first overheard conversation, a broad-shouldered figure named Cassian who, as she eventually learned through careful eavesdropping among the guards, served as Halden's personal aide, and had joined the estate's staff only a few months before Garrick arrived in the kitchen. 2 new arrivals, closely connected, both present in the exact time frame when the king's health began to decline. It felt like far too great a coincidence to ignore. One afternoon, while polishing silverware in a small alcove near the council chamber, Illyra overheard Haldan and Cassian once more, their voices lower this time, more cautious, as though they too sensed the danger of being overheard. "The gathering approaches quickly," Cassian murmured. "If his strength has not weakened enough by then, the challenge will fail before it begins. The other alphas will see him as strong, and our position collapses entirely." "Patience," Haldan replied. "The dosage increases steadily. By the time of the full moon, he will barely be able to stand before the assembly, let alone defend his claim to leadership. No one will suspect illness brought on by anything but the burdens of his crown. We have been careful. We will continue to be careful." Illyra's hands stilled over the silver in her lap, her breath catching in her throat. There it was again, unmistakable this time, clear confirmation of everything she had feared. Someone was deliberately weakening the king before an important gathering, planning to use his sudden apparent frailty to challenge his position, perhaps even to remove him from power entirely. She did not know exactly what form that challenge might take, only that it was coming, and that King Draven remained completely unaware of the danger closing in around him. She forced herself to remain still and silent until the voices faded once more, until she was certain Haldan and Cassian had moved far enough away not to notice her trembling hands, or her too quick breathing. Only then did she gather the silverware and hurry back toward the servants' quarters, her mind racing faster than her feet. She now had two pieces of damning information, the hidden vials of unidentified powder, and two separate overheard conversations, confirming a deliberate plot against the king's health and position. It was more than she had ever hoped to gather, yet it still felt achingly incomplete. She had no solid proof beyond her own word, no vial she could safely remove and present without risking immediate suspicion falling upon herself, no witness beyond her own frightened ears. That night, unable to sleep, Illyra made a decision that frightened her more than anything else she had done so far. She would find a way to speak with the king directly, consequences be damned. She could not continue watching him weaken day by day, while she waited for perfect proof that might never come. Sometimes, she told herself, borrowing her brother's steady wisdom once more, a healer does not wait for full certainty before acting to save a life. Sometimes waiting too long is its own kind of failure. She did not yet know how she would manage to reach him, a king surrounded by guards and advisors, protected by layers of protocol that a simple maid could never hope to bypass easily. But she knew now, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that she had to try. The full moon gathering was drawing closer with every passing day, and somewhere within these grand stone walls, a king who trusted his own counsel, completely remained blind to the danger tightening around him like a slow, patient hand. The opportunity Illyra had been waiting for arrived sooner than she expected, though not in any way she could have planned. It was late evening, past the hour when most staff had retired to their quarters, and she had been sent to deliver a fresh set of candles to the private study near the king's chambers, a task usually reserved for a more senior maid. But one of the older women had fallen ill that day, and duties had been shuffled quickly to cover the gap. Illyra accepted the task without complaint, her mind already calculating how close it would bring her to the one man she desperately needed to speak with, yet had no clear way to approach. The corridor leading to the private study was quiet, lit only by soft lantern light along the stone walls. She knocked lightly on the study door, as she had been instructed, and a deep voice from within told her to enter. She pushed the door open, expecting to leave the candles on a side table and depart quickly, as proper conduct demanded. Instead, she found King Draven seated alone at his desk, a stack of parchment before him, his expression tired in a way that went beyond simple fatigue. There was something almost hollow behind his eyes, a weariness that no amount of sleep seemed able to touch. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Illyra set the candles down with hands that trembled slightly, acutely aware that this might be the only private moment she would ever have with him. Every instinct told her to complete her task quickly and leave, to maintain the invisible boundary between servant and king that had been drilled into her since her very first day. Yet another instinct, louder and more insistent, told her that if she walked away now, she might never find another chance, and the danger, closing in around him, would continue unchecked. "Forgive me, my king," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt, "but I must speak with you about something important, even though I have no right to trouble you with it." Draven set down his quill slowly, studying her, with the same sharp attention she had noticed from their very first meeting. Most staff would never dare say such a thing to him directly, and his curiosity, perhaps mixed with the deep exhaustion that made him less guarded than usual, won out over protocol. "Speak," he said simply. Elira took a breath, choosing her words as carefully as she could, aware that everything now depended on how she presented what she knew. She told him of the conversation she had overheard weeks earlier in the servants' passage, of Councilman Halden's voice discussing a dosage meant to weaken him before the full moon gathering. She told him of the hidden box of unmarked powder discovered in the pantry, and of the second conversation between Halden and his aide Cassian, confirming a deliberate plan to ensure the king appeared frail and weak before the other alphas, undermining his standing at a critical moment. She expected anger. She expected disbelief, perhaps even immediate dismissal from her position, for daring to accuse trusted members of his own council. Instead, Draven listened in complete silence, his expression unreadable, though something flickered behind his tired eyes as she spoke, something that looked almost like recognition, as though pieces of a puzzle he had not fully acknowledged were suddenly beginning to align. When she finished, the study fell into a heavy silence. Draven rose from his desk and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the darkened courtyard below, his back to her for a long moment before he finally spoke. "I have felt it," he admitted quietly, more to himself than to her. "The weakness, the fog in my mind some mornings. I told myself it was simply the weight of leadership, the price every alpha pays eventually. I did not want to believe it could be something else, something deliberate." Elira remained silent, unsure whether she should speak further or simply wait. Draven turned back to face her, his expression harder now, sharper, the exhaustion still visible, but overlaid now with something far more dangerous, a cold, focused anger beginning to take shape. "Why would you risk telling me this?" he asked. "You could have said nothing, stayed silent, kept your position safe, and let the council's business remain the council's business." "Because it is not right," Elira answered simply, her voice steadier now, that the worst of her confession had passed. "Because a king who does not know he is in danger cannot protect himself, or his people, and I could not stay silent while that danger grew closer with every passing day." Draven studied her for a long moment, and Elira felt the full weight of his attention, sharper and more assessing than anything she had experienced before. She did not know what he saw in her face, but whatever it was, it seemed to satisfy something within him, at least enough to consider her words seriously, rather than dismiss them outright. "I cannot act on suspicion alone," he finally said. "Halden has served my family for over a decade. Cassian arrived under Halden's recommendation, trusted without question. If I move against them without proof, and I am wrong, it will fracture my council at the worst possible time, just before the gathering where unity matters most. But if you are right, and I do nothing, the consequences could be far worse." "I understand," Elira said, though her heart sank slightly at his caution. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that simply telling him the truth would be enough to set things right immediately. Instead, she realized, the truth was only the beginning. Now they would need proof strong enough to convince not just the king, but likely his entire council, that a betrayal was taking place within their own ranks. Draven crossed the room and, to her surprise, did not dismiss her as she expected. Instead, he asked her to sit, gesturing to a chair near his desk, a gesture of respect she had never anticipated receiving from an Alpha King. Together, speaking in low voices late into the night, they began to piece together a plan. Draven would begin observing his own council more closely, without revealing that he suspected anything, testing their reactions carefully in the days ahead. Elira would continue her quiet watch over the kitchen and the movements of Halden and Cassian, gathering whatever small pieces of evidence she safely could, without drawing suspicion to herself. It was a fragile plan, built on caution and careful timing, yet it was more than Elira had dared hope for when she first decided to risk everything by speaking to him directly. As she finally rose to leave the study near midnight, Draven stopped her at the door with a final question. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Elira, my king," she answered. "Thank you, Elira," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that startled her more than anything else that had happened that evening. "Whatever comes of this, know that you have done something tonight that took more courage than most of my council has shown in years." She left the study with her heart still pounding, though now for entirely different reasons than the fear that had gripped her for weeks. She had done it. She had spoken the truth to the king himself, and rather than dismissing her, he had listened, truly listened, and chosen to act rather than ignore her. It was only a first step, she reminded herself, as she made her way back through the quiet corridors toward the servants' quarters, and the most dangerous parts of this fight likely still lay ahead. But for the first time since she had overheard that fateful conversation weeks earlier, Alira allowed herself a small, cautious flicker of hope. The days that followed brought a new kind of tension to the estate, one that Alira could feel humming beneath the surface of every ordinary interaction, even though no one else seemed to notice anything had changed. Draven began attending council meetings with a new sharpness in his gaze, asking pointed questions he had never bothered with before, watching Halden's reactions carefully whenever certain topics arose. He gave no outward sign that his suspicions had been confirmed, maintaining the same tired, burdened demeanor that had characterized him for weeks, careful not to alert his enemies that their plan had been discovered. Alira, for her part, continued her careful observations from the shadows of her ordinary duties, memorizing patterns, noting small details, always careful never to let her growing knowledge show on her face whenever Garrick or Halden or Cassian crossed her path. It was exhausting, carrying such a heavy secret while performing the same simple chores day after day, smiling politely, curtsying respectfully, pretending to be nothing more than an unremarkable maid even as she quietly worked to unravel a conspiracy that threatened to topple the entire pack's leadership. Neither of them yet knew how close their enemies were to completing their plan, nor how quickly the full moon gathering was approaching. Time, Alira realized with growing unease, was becoming their greatest enemy of all, and every day that passed without solid proof was another day Halden and his allies moved closer to achieving whatever dark purpose they had set in motion. Word traveled quickly through the servants' quarters, as it always did, though the version that reached Alira's ears bore little resemblance to the truth. Someone had noticed the king asking unusual questions during council meetings, and the rumor mill had spun the story into something about a disagreement over trade routes with a neighboring pack. Alira said nothing to correct the gossip, grateful that the true reason behind Draven's new sharpness remained hidden beneath layers of harmless speculation. Still, she could not shake the feeling that Halden had begun watching her more closely than before. It was subtle, nothing she could point to directly, but she noticed his eyes lingering on her a beat too long whenever their paths crossed in the halls, a flicker of calculation behind his usually composed expression. She told herself it might be nothing more than her own fear coloring ordinary glances, yet the unease refused to fade. Odette summoned her one afternoon to the linen room, and Alira's stomach tightened with immediate dread, certain she was about to be questioned or dismissed. Instead, the head housekeeper simply informed her that she was being reassigned, effective immediately, to assist with deep cleaning duties in the eastern wing, far from the private chambers and the council rooms she had grown so familiar with. "I did not request this change," Odette added, her expression unreadable. "It came directly from Councilman Halden's office. He said the private wing required more experienced staff, given the upcoming gathering preparations." Alira kept her expression carefully neutral, though panic surged beneath her calm exterior. Being moved away from the private wing meant losing her ability to watch Garrick's kitchen, to overhear conversations near the council chamber, to remain close enough to King Draven that she might notice any sudden change in his condition. It felt less like an innocent reassignment, and more like a deliberate attempt to remove her from a position where she could continue causing trouble, though she could not understand how Halden might have grown suspicious of her specifically. She spent that evening desperately trying to find a way to inform Draven of the change, but with her new duties keeping her far from his part of the estate, opportunities for private conversation had suddenly become far more difficult to arrange. She considered asking one of the guards to pass along a message, but she had no way of knowing which guards could be trusted, and a careless word in the wrong ears could undo everything they had worked to keep hidden. Fortune, or perhaps simple chance, offered her an unexpected opening 2 days later. While carrying a stack of freshly cleaned linens toward the eastern wing, she passed through a courtyard just as Draven himself was crossing with a small group of guards, returning from what appeared to be a training session judging by the light sheen of exertion still visible on his brow. Their eyes met briefly across the open space, and though neither could risk stopping to speak directly with guards present, Alira allowed herself a small, deliberate nod. hoping he would understand it as a signal that something had changed. To her relief, later that same evening, a young stable boy she did not recognize approached her quietly, near the servants' entrance, and pressed a small folded note into her hand, before disappearing without a word. Alone in the corner of the empty linen room, she unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, clearly written in haste. I noticed your reassignment. Meet me in the old chapel behind the eastern garden 2 hours past sunset. Come alone, and tell no one. There was no signature, but Alira knew immediately who had sent it. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the note back up and tucked it carefully into the hem of her sleeve, her mind racing with equal parts relief and renewed fear. The old chapel sat at the far edge of the estate grounds, rarely used since a newer, grander chapel had been built closer to the main house years earlier. It was isolated, quiet, exactly the kind of place where two people might speak without fear of being overheard, but also exactly the kind of place where danger could arrive unnoticed and unchallenged. When the appointed hour finally arrived, Alira slipped away from the servants' quarters under the pretense of fetching water from the garden well, a task ordinary enough not to draw suspicion even at such a late hour. The night air was cool and carried the faint scent of late-blooming flowers as she made her way carefully along the garden path, her senses alert to every rustle of leaves and distant sound. The old chapel emerged from the darkness ahead, its stone walls weathered and ivy-covered, a single soft light glowing faintly from within one of its narrow windows. She pushed open the heavy wooden door carefully and found Draven already waiting inside, seated on one of the old wooden benches, a single lantern casting flickering shadows across the chapel's worn interior. You should not be out here alone at this hour, she said, before she could stop herself, immediately regretting the informality of her tone toward a king. He offered a tired but genuine smile in response. Neither should you, he replied, and yet here we both are. She told him quickly of her sudden reassignment, of Halden's apparent involvement in the decision, and of her fear that her growing suspicions had somehow reached the councilman's attention. Draven listened with the same focused seriousness he had shown during their first conversation, his jaw tightening as she spoke. He grows cautious, Draven said finally. That worries me more than if he had done nothing at all. A man who feels safe makes mistakes. A man who feels watched becomes careful, and careful men are far harder to catch. We may not have much time then, Alira said quietly. If the gathering is close, and he fears discovery, he may act sooner than planned, rather than risk waiting. Draven nodded slowly, his expression grim in the lantern light. I have been testing my own strength each morning, quietly, away from watching eyes. It grows weaker still, despite everything. Whatever they are using, it continues working even now, though I have eaten far more cautiously since our first conversation. Alira felt a fresh wave of fear at his words. If the poisoning continued despite his caution, it meant the substance was likely already deeply embedded in his system, perhaps administered through more than just his meals, or perhaps built up over enough weeks that stopping fresh doses was no longer enough to reverse the damage quickly. They needed a healer, someone with real knowledge of such things, someone who could examine him properly and confirm exactly what had been done, and hopefully offer a way to counter it. I know someone, Alira said suddenly, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. My brother trains as a healer in the Southern Territories. He has studied old remedies, herb lore, exactly the kind of knowledge that might identify what has been used against you. He is not here, but perhaps I could write to him, describe the symptoms carefully, ask what might be done. It was a fragile hope, built on distance and uncertain timing, but it was more than either of them had before. Draven agreed cautiously, though he warned her to word any letter carefully, in case it fell into the wrong hands before reaching its intended recipient. They agreed to meet again in 3 days' time, same place, same hour, to share whatever progress each had made. As Alira slipped back toward the servants' quarters that night, water jug in hand as her alibi, she felt the full weight of what she had taken on settling more heavily onto her shoulders than ever before. She was no longer simply a maid who had overheard something troubling. She had become an active participant in a dangerous game, one where a single misstep could cost not only her own safety, but potentially the life of the Alpha King himself, and the stability of the entire pack he ruled. She wrote to her brother that very night, choosing her words with painstaking care, describing vague symptoms of fatigue, tremors, and mental fog, without revealing whose condition she truly described, framing it instead as concern for an elderly relative she wished to help from afar. She sealed the letter and arranged for it to be sent with the regular morning post, praying it would reach him quickly, and that his knowledge might offer some answer neither she nor Draven could find on their own within the walls of an estate now thick with hidden danger and growing suspicion. 5 days passed before a response arrived. 5 days during which Alira threw herself into her new duties in the Eastern Wing, with outward diligence, scrubbing floors and beating dust from old tapestries, while her mind remained fixed on the growing danger. She could no longer watch as closely as before. The distance from the private wing gnawed at her constantly. She had no way of knowing whether Draven's condition had worsened, whether Halden and Cassian had made new moves, or whether Garrick continued preparing whatever poison had been slipped so carefully into the king's meals for weeks. When her brother's letter finally arrived, delivered discreetly by the same stable boy who had brought Draven's note days earlier, Alira retreated to a quiet corner of the garden to read it in private. Her brother's handwriting was neat and careful, clearly written with the seriousness of someone taking her described concerns to heart, even without knowing the true identity of the person she described. The symptoms you describe, tremors, mental fog, gradual weakening despite otherwise good health, closely resemble a condition caused by prolonged exposure to a rare herb blend once used generations ago in certain conflicts between rival packs, he had written. It is called wolfsbane ash by old healers, though the name has fallen out of common use. It does not kill quickly. Instead, it slowly dampens a wolf's natural strength and senses over weeks, mimicking the appearance of ordinary illness or exhaustion so effectively that it often goes undetected until the affected person has grown dangerously weak. If your relative has been exposed to this over an extended period, immediate cessation of exposure is critical, though full recovery may take considerable time, even after exposure stops. There does exist an old counter-remedy, a specific combination of herbs that can help flush the substance from the body more quickly, though the ingredients are rare and not commonly found outside specialized healers' stores. I have included the recipe below, should you need it. Alira read the letter twice more, her heart hammering with a mixture of relief and renewed urgency. It confirmed everything she had feared, everything Halden and Cassian had discussed in those overheard conversations. Wolfsbane ash, a poison old enough and obscure enough that few in the current generation would recognize its effects, exactly the kind of weapon a careful conspirator might choose, specifically because it would be so difficult to identify. She memorized the counter-remedy recipe carefully, before tucking the letter safely away, and that evening, under the same careful pretense of fetching water, she made her way once more to the old chapel, to share what she had learned with Draven. He listened with tightly controlled anger, as she read him the details of her brother's letter, his hands clenched into fists at his sides by the time she finished. Wolfsbane ash, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. My father spoke of it once, long ago, as a weapon from darker times, one most packs agreed never to use again after the old conflicts ended. To find it being used now, within my own household, is almost harder to accept than the betrayal itself. Can we gather the ingredients for the counter-remedy? Alira asked, though she already suspected the answer would not be simple. Draven shook his head slowly. Rare ingredients cannot be gathered quietly without drawing attention, especially not now, with Halden watching everything more closely since your reassignment. If I suddenly requested such specific and unusual herbs, it would confirm to him immediately that his plan has been discovered, and he may act rashly, rather than risk further exposure. They sat in tense silence for a long moment, the weight of their limited options settling heavily over the small chapel. Finally, Draven spoke again, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. There is another path, though it carries its own risk. If I stop consuming anything prepared directly by Garrick, insisting instead on simpler meals prepared under closer supervision, the poisoning itself might slow, even without the counter-remedy. It will not undo the damage already done, but it may prevent things from growing worse before the gathering arrives. It felt like a small, fragile plan, built upon an already fragile foundation, but Alira agreed it was likely their safest immediate option. Draven decided he would begin requesting simpler meals, claiming a change in appetite due to the stresses of upcoming diplomatic preparations. a believable excuse that would not immediately alert Garrick or Halden to the true reason behind the sudden shift. As they prepared to part ways once more, Draven hesitated at the chapel door, turning back to face her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something softer beneath the exhaustion and controlled anger that had defined most of their previous meetings. "I do not know how to properly thank you for what you have done," he said quietly. "You risked everything, your position, your safety, to bring me a truth I might never have discovered on my own until it was far too late to matter. Whatever happens from here, know that I will not forget it." Illyra felt heat rise to her cheeks, despite the seriousness of the situation. Unused to such direct gratitude from anyone, let alone an Alpha King, she managed only a quiet thank you in return, before slipping back out into the night, her water jug once again serving as her innocent alibi, as she made her way back toward the servants' quarters. The following days brought small, cautious changes that Illyra observed carefully from her position in the eastern wing, gathered mostly through careful listening among the other kitchen and household staff. Draven had indeed begun requesting simpler meals, framed publicly as a health-conscious decision meant to keep his mind sharp during the demanding preparations for the upcoming gathering. Garrick, according to whispered gossip among the kitchen girls, had seemed mildly annoyed by the sudden change, but had complied without open objection, preparing plain, simple dishes that required little of his usual careful attention. Illyra allowed herself a cautious flicker of hope that their plan might be working, that perhaps the worst of the danger could be slowed while they searched for a more permanent solution. That hope, however, proved short-lived. Barely a week after Draven's dietary changes began, Illyra overheard troubling news while helping carry supplies near the kitchen entrance, a task that occasionally still brought her briefly back into contact with her old territory, despite her official reassignment. Two of the kitchen girls were speaking in hushed, worried tones near the pantry, unaware of her presence nearby, as she waited to collect a delivery of clean cloths.
"Did you hear?"
One girl whispered to the other. "Councilman Halden has requested that all meal preparations, including the King's simplified requests, be personally reviewed by him before serving, starting immediately, given the sensitivity of the upcoming gathering preparations." Illyra's blood ran cold at the words. If Halden began personally overseeing every meal, it meant he had likely grown suspicious enough of the King's sudden change in habits to insert himself more directly into the process, perhaps searching for a new way to continue the poisoning despite Draven's precautions, or perhaps preparing to act more aggressively now that his original slow method had been disrupted. She hurried to complete her task and left the kitchen area as quickly as she could without drawing attention, her mind spinning with the implications of what she had just overheard. Their careful, cautious plan had bought them a small measure of safety, but it had also, it seemed, alerted their enemy to the fact that something had changed. And an enemy who knew his original plan had been disrupted was a far more dangerous enemy than one who believed himself still safely hidden in the shadows. She needed to warn Draven immediately, yet with Halden now watching so closely, arranging another private meeting felt more dangerous than ever before. Time, which had already felt achingly short, now seemed to be collapsing entirely, the full moon gathering drawing ever closer, while the danger surrounding the King grew sharper and more immediate with each passing day. Illyra spent the rest of that day searching for any safe way to reach Draven, growing more anxious with every passing hour. Sending another note through the stable boy felt riskier now, given Halden's heightened attention throughout the estate, and she could not risk another late-night meeting at the old chapel without knowing whether she was being watched. She forced herself to remain patient, completing her assigned duties with outward calm, even as worry gnawed steadily at her thoughts. The opportunity she needed arrived unexpectedly during the evening meal service, when Odette, still unaware of the deeper reasons behind Illyra's earlier reassignment, was asked to send additional staff to assist in the main dining hall, due to preparations for a small diplomatic dinner, with visiting representatives from a neighboring pack. Illyra volunteered immediately, careful to keep her enthusiasm from seeming unusual, and was assigned to help serve alongside several other maids under close supervision. The dining hall buzzed with quiet formality as guests arrived, King Draven seated at the head of the long table, Halden positioned close beside him with an attentiveness that struck Illyra as more watchful than dutiful. She moved carefully among the serving staff, refilling water glasses and clearing empty dishes, always keeping her expression neutral, even as her attention remained sharply focused on finding any opportunity to pass along a warning without drawing suspicion. Her chance came near the end of the meal, when she was tasked with refilling Draven's water glass directly, a small enough duty that it required her to lean close beside him for just a moment. As she poured, she kept her voice barely above a whisper, pitched so only he could hear amid the surrounding conversation. "He watches everything now," she murmured. "Reviewing every meal personally. He knows something has changed." She straightened immediately after speaking, continuing her duties as though nothing unusual had occurred, though she felt Draven's gaze flicker toward her for the briefest moment before he returned his attention smoothly to the conversation at hand. If Halden had noticed anything unusual in the brief exchange, he gave no outward sign, continuing to speak pleasantly with the visiting representatives beside him. Later that night, Elira received another folded note, delivered this time not by the stable boy but tucked discreetly beneath a stack of linens she was meant to collect from a supply closet near the eastern wing, a clever method that avoided any direct contact that might draw attention. The message was brief. "Chapel, same hour, tomorrow night. We must decide quickly." The following evening, Elira made her way once more through the quiet garden paths toward the old chapel, her nerves stretched tight with the awareness that every meeting now carried greater risk than the last. Draven was already waiting when she arrived, pacing slowly near the old stone altar, his expression tense in a way she had not seen before. "Halden's sudden interest in reviewing every meal personally confirms our fears," he said without preamble as she entered. "He knows the original method has been disrupted. I do not know yet whether he suspects I am aware of his plan specifically, or simply believes I have grown cautious by coincidence. But either way, he is adapting, and adapting quickly." "What will you do?" Elira asked, closing the heavy chapel door carefully behind her. Draven stopped his pacing and turned to face her fully. "I have decided I can wait no longer for certainty before acting. The gathering is only 10 days away now. If Halden's plan was to weaken me before then, and that plan has been disrupted, he may attempt something faster, more direct, rather than risk the gathering arriving with me at greater strength than he intended. I must move against him before he moves against me." Elira felt a fresh wave of fear at his words, though she understood the logic behind them, waiting for perfect proof, for an undeniable piece of evidence that could satisfy the entire council beyond doubt, had always been the ideal outcome, but ideal outcomes rarely survived contact with genuine danger. Sometimes, as she had reminded herself so many times over the past weeks, a person had to act with the knowledge they possessed, even if that knowledge remained incomplete. "I intend to confront Halden directly," Draven continued, though carefully, without revealing the full extent of what I know. "I will watch his reaction closely. A guilty man, confronted unexpectedly, often reveals himself through the very act of his denial. If I can provoke him into an unguarded moment, perhaps in front of witnesses who cannot later be dismissed as unreliable, it may be enough to expose him properly." It felt like a dangerous gamble, one that could easily fail if Halden proved too composed, too practiced in his deception, to reveal anything through a simple confrontation. Yet Elira could offer no better alternative, and time had grown too short to search for one. She agreed cautiously to Draven's plan, though her stomach churned with worry over what might happen if it went wrong. "There is something else you should know," she said quietly, before they parted for the night. "Garrick, the steward who prepares your meals. He arrived at the estate only shortly before your symptoms began, replacing an older cook who left suddenly, without much explanation. It may be worth learning more about where Garrick came from, and whether Halden was the one who recommended his hiring." Draven's expression sharpened at this new detail, clearly turning the information over carefully in his mind. If Garrick's hiring traces directly back to Halden, it will strengthen the case considerably, giving me firmer ground to stand on when I confront him. They agreed to meet again in 3 days, allowing Draven time to quietly investigate Garrick's background and to prepare for whatever confrontation lay ahead. As Elira made her way back toward the servants' quarters that night, she felt the full weight of how quickly events had begun accelerating, a slow, simmering conspiracy, suddenly rushing toward some inevitable breaking point neither she nor Draven could fully control. 3 days later, when she returned once more to the old chapel under cover of darkness, she found Draven waiting with a grim, determined expression that told her immediately he had learned something significant. Garrick was indeed recommended personally by Halden, he said without preamble as she entered. Further inquiry revealed that the old cook he replaced did not retire willingly, as we were told. He was quietly dismissed, given a generous sum of money, and instructed to leave the estate immediately and never return, ostensibly for an unrelated disciplinary matter that no one seems able to clearly explain when questioned directly. It was exactly the kind of confirmation they had desperately needed, another thread connecting Halden directly to the deliberate poisoning that had been slowly unfolding for weeks. Draven's jaw was set with a hard, controlled anger as he continued. I intend to confront him tomorrow evening, during the smaller council gathering held before the larger diplomatic assembly begins. Several trusted members will be present, witnesses who cannot easily be silenced or dismissed if Halden reveals himself through his reaction. I want you present as well, hidden nearby, close enough to hear and remember everything that is said, in case further testimony becomes necessary afterward. Elira agreed immediately, despite the fear that gripped her at the thought of being present, even hidden, during such a dangerous confrontation. She had come too far now, risked too much, to step back from the final crucial moments of the very conspiracy she had first stumbled upon weeks earlier, in a quiet servant's passage. Whatever happened during that confrontation, she intended to see it through to its conclusion, for her own sake, and for the sake of a king who had trusted her with the truth when no one else around her had been willing to listen. The following evening arrived with a tension Elira could feel pressing against her chest from the moment she woke. She spent the day performing her duties with practiced calm, though every small sound made her flinch. Every glance from a passing guard felt sharper than usual. By the time evening approached, she had positioned herself, with Draven's careful instruction, in a small servant's alcove connected by a narrow passage to the private council chamber, close enough to hear every word spoken within, yet hidden completely from view behind a heavy tapestry that had hung there for generations. The council members arrived one by one, their voices low and formal as they settled into their usual seats around the long wooden table. Elira recognized most of them from her weeks of careful observation, though her attention remained fixed most sharply on Halden, who entered last, composed and unreadable as always, taking his customary seat near the head of the table, beside where Draven would soon sit. When Draven finally entered, the room fell into respectful silence, the council members rising briefly, before settling once more as he took his seat. Elira watched through a narrow gap in the tapestry, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might somehow be heard through the thick stone walls. Draven's expression gave nothing away, calm and measured, as he began addressing routine matters first, discussing final preparations for the upcoming gathering, trade agreements to be finalized, security arrangements for visiting representatives from neighboring packs. Then, without warning, his tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable, and Elira felt her entire body tense with anticipation. Before we conclude, Draven said, his gaze moving deliberately around the table before settling directly on Halden, there is a matter I wish to address personally. I have grown curious about certain recent changes within my household. The sudden departure of my longtime cook, replaced by a steward recommended personally by you, Halden, occurring at almost precisely the same time my health began its unexplained decline. The room went utterly still. Elira watched, barely breathing, as every council member's attention shifted immediately toward Halden, whose composed expression flickered for just an instant, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, before smoothing over once more into calm, practiced neutrality. My king, Halden said carefully, his voice measured. I recommended Garrick because of his exceptional skill, nothing more. As for your health, I have been as concerned as anyone. Perhaps it would be wise to consult additional physicians, rather than assume something more sinister lies behind simple exhaustion. It was a smooth deflection, exactly the kind of composed denial Draven had warned might occur. Elira felt a flicker of despair at how calmly Halden managed to redirect suspicion, wondering whether their entire plan might fail here, in this very room, if he continued deflecting with such practiced ease. But Draven was not finished. Curious then, he continued, his voice hardening slightly, that my symptoms have noticeably lessened since I began requesting simpler meals, prepared under closer supervision, only for you to immediately insert yourself into overseeing meal preparation directly afterward. Almost as though something about the change troubled you specifically. A murmur rippled through the other council members, confusion and growing unease visible on several faces as they began to follow the implications of Draven's carefully chosen words. Halden's composure cracked slightly further, a flash of something sharper, more dangerous, passing behind his eyes before he could fully mask it. "I only sought to ensure your safety, my king, given the sensitivity of the upcoming gathering," Halden said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. Draven leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving Halden's face. "Then you will not object to my physician conducting a thorough examination immediately, tonight, testing for any unusual substances that might explain my prolonged symptoms. And you will not object to Garrick's kitchen being searched, along with a full accounting of every ingredient he has used these past several weeks." The silence that followed stretched unbearably long. Illyra watched from her hidden position, as something in Halden's expression finally shifted entirely, the calm mask slipping just enough to reveal the cold calculation beneath. He glanced quickly around the table, perhaps assessing whether any allies remained who might support him, before his gaze settled back on Draven, with a hardness that confirmed everything Illyra had feared for weeks. "You would not have asked such questions," he said slowly, his voice suddenly stripped of its earlier respectful tone, "unless someone had already spoken to you. Someone close enough to your household to notice things they should never have been paying attention to in the first place." Illyra's blood ran cold. Somehow, in that single sharp moment, Halden had guessed the truth, or close enough to it, that Draven's careful confrontation had not simply been born from his own suspicion, but from information provided by someone within the estate's staff. She watched, frozen with fear, as Halden's eyes swept briefly toward the tapestry where she hid, though she could not be certain whether he truly suspected her specific location, or simply scanned the room out of pure defensive instinct. Draven rose slowly from his seat, his expression now openly hard, all pretense of calm curiosity abandoned entirely. "It matters little how I came to ask these questions, Halden. What matters now is whether you can answer them honestly, or whether your reaction has already answered them for you." The other council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly beginning to understand that something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding was unfolding before them. One of the older council members, a woman named Leora who had served the pack for decades, spoke up cautiously. "Halden, if there is truth to these concerns, it would be far wiser to speak honestly now, before matters escalate further." Halden's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Illyra feared he might simply deny everything outright, forcing Draven to follow through on his threat of physical examinations and kitchen searches, a process that would take time during which Halden or his allies might attempt something far more drastic to prevent the truth from fully surfacing. Instead, to her surprise, he rose slowly from his seat as well, his composure fully abandoned now, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. "You have grown too strong, too settled in your position," Halden said quietly, addressing Draven directly, his voice carrying a bitterness that had clearly been building for far longer than Illyra had realized. "Your father never should have named you his successor over more experienced candidates. I have watched this pack drift steadily under leadership too young, too untested, to properly guide us through the challenges ahead. I did what I believed necessary to correct that mistake, before real damage could be done to our people's future." The confession, delivered with such cold conviction, sent a ripple of shock through the assembled council members. Illyra felt her own breath catch, relief and horror mixing together, as she realized their plan had finally, truly worked. Halden had revealed himself, openly, before witnesses who could not later claim ignorance or disbelief. But even as the confession settled over the room, Illyra noticed something else, a subtle shift near the chamber's main entrance, where Cassian, Halden's aide, had been standing quietly near the door throughout the entire confrontation. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward something concealed beneath his cloak, and Illyra's heart lurched with sudden, sharp alarm. Whatever Halden's confession meant for the confrontation happening at the table, Cassian's movement suggested the danger in this room was far from finished. Illyra did not think. She simply acted, pushing aside the heavy tapestry and stepping out into the open chamber, her voice ringing out with more force than she knew she possessed. "Watch the door," she called out, pointing directly at Cassian, whose hand froze halfway toward his cloak at the sudden interruption, his eyes widening with surprise at her unexpected appearance. The room erupted into motion immediately. Two of the king's personal guards, stationed just outside the chamber for the meeting, burst through the door at the sound of raised voices, moving quickly to restrain Cassian before he could complete whatever action he had been preparing. He struggled briefly against their grip, his composed demeanor finally shattering entirely. But the guards held him firm, and within moments he had been fully subdued and disarmed of a small concealed vial he had been reaching for, one that Draven's physician would later confirm contained a highly concentrated dose of the same wolfsbane ash that had been slowly weakening the king for weeks. Halden, seeing his aide restrained and his plan collapsing entirely around him, made a desperate attempt to flee toward a side exit near the council chamber, but the remaining guards moved swiftly to block his path, and within moments he too stood restrained, his earlier cold confidence replaced by the panicked realization that his conspiracy had been fully exposed before the very witnesses he had once hoped to manipulate. The chamber fell into a tense, shocked silence as the guards secured both men, the other council members staring in stunned disbelief at how quickly the confrontation had escalated from careful questioning to open, undeniable betrayal. Draven remained standing at the head of the table, his expression a mixture of controlled fury and profound relief, his gaze moving finally toward Alira, still standing where she had stepped out from behind the tapestry, her heart pounding so violently she could barely stand still. "You knew," Leora said slowly, looking between Alira and Draven with dawning understanding. "This was not simple suspicion. You already knew, and had proof enough to act." Draven nodded slowly, his gaze remaining on Alira with an expression of deep gratitude. "This young woman brought me the truth weeks ago, when I had no idea anything was wrong at all," he said, addressing the full council now. "She risked her position, and very likely her safety, to ensure I did not walk blindly into the gathering weakened and vulnerable, exactly as Halden intended. Had she remained silent, as many in her position might reasonably have chosen to do, I have little doubt Cassian would have succeeded tonight in finishing what weeks of poison had already begun." The council members turned to look at Alira, with expressions ranging from surprise to genuine respect, a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment she had received from Odette weeks earlier, when she first tried to raise her concerns. She felt heat rise to her cheeks under the sudden weight of so many eyes, unused to being seen at all within these grand halls, let alone regarded with such open admiration. Halden, still restrained by the guards, glared across the room at her with undisguised contempt. "A maid," he spat bitterly. All of this undone by a maid no one thought worth listening to. Draven's expression hardened further at the remark. "Perhaps that is precisely why your plan failed, Halden. You assumed that because someone held a lesser position within this household, their eyes and ears mattered less, their loyalty counted for nothing. You were wrong, and that error has cost you everything." The guards led both Halden and Cassian away to be held securely while a full investigation could be conducted, and Draven immediately summoned his physician to examine him thoroughly, confirming what Alira's brother's letter had already suggested weeks earlier. That prolonged exposure to wolfsbane ash had significantly weakened the king's natural strength and senses, though the physician expressed cautious optimism that with proper treatment and the counter-remedy Alira had already provided, a full recovery remained entirely possible, particularly given how much sooner the poisoning had been discovered compared to how Halden had originally intended. In the chaotic hours that followed, as guards searched Garrick's kitchen and confirmed the presence of the hidden vials Alira had discovered weeks earlier, and as council members began the difficult process of determining how such a betrayal had gone unnoticed for so long, Alira found herself largely forgotten amid the larger unfolding crisis, quietly retreating to the edges of the chamber, uncertain of her place now that the truth she had fought so hard to reveal had finally come fully into the light. It was Draven himself who sought her out later that night, finding her standing quietly near the chamber's entrance as the last of the guards departed with their prisoners. The exhaustion that had marked his features for weeks remained visible, but something else had settled over him as well, a clarity and determination that had been absent during their earlier, more uncertain meetings. "It is not over yet," he said quietly, "though the immediate danger has passed." Garrick was arrested as well, found attempting to flee the estate grounds shortly after word of Halden's exposure spread through the household staff. He will need to answer for his role in this as well, though I suspect he acted more out of fear and financial incentive than genuine malice toward me personally. Illyra nodded, still processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in what felt like both an eternity and mere moments. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Draven considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Now, I begin the slow process of recovery, both for my body and for a council that has just discovered betrayal within its own trusted ranks. The gathering will proceed as planned, though I intend to attend with far greater caution than I might have shown even a month ago. And you," he added, his gaze softening slightly as it settled on her, "you will not be returning to the Eastern Wing, nor will you continue serving in obscurity, as though tonight never happened." Illyra felt a flicker of uncertainty at his words, unsure what exactly he intended, though the warmth in his tone offered some reassurance against the fear that had defined so much of her time within these walls. Whatever came next, she realized, her life within Draven Hollow had changed irrevocably. The quiet, unremarkable existence she had once hoped for, now replaced by something far more complicated and far more significant than she ever could have imagined when she first walked through the estate's grand front gates weeks earlier. News of Halden's betrayal spread through the estate within a single day, transforming from careful whispers into open discussion among staff who had once considered such things far above their notice. Illyra found herself the subject of considerable attention, some of it admiring, some of it uncertain, as the other maids and kitchen staff struggled to reconcile the quiet, unremarkable woman they had worked alongside for weeks with the story now circulating about a maid who had uncovered a plot against the Alpha King himself. Odette, who had once dismissed her concerns so firmly, approached her cautiously during the following morning's duties, her usual stern composure replaced by something closer to embarrassed uncertainty. "I did not know," she said simply, her eyes not quite meeting Illyra's. "I told you to forget what you heard, and had I known the truth of it, I never would have spoken so carelessly. I hope you can understand that dismissing concerns from staff is often simply how things are done here, not because your voice did not matter, but because so few voices ever turn out to carry something this significant." Illyra accepted the apology with quiet grace, understanding that Odette's caution had come from years of institutional habit rather than genuine malice. "I understand," she said. "I nearly gave up more than once myself, uncertain whether anyone would ever believe me." The formal investigation into Halden and Cassian's actions continued over the following days, with Garrick eventually confirming under careful questioning that Halden had recruited him specifically for his skill with herbs and poisons, offering substantial payment in exchange for gradually introducing wolfsbane ash into the king's private meals over an extended period. Garrick claimed he had believed the substance would only cause temporary weakness, not lasting harm, though the physician's assessment suggested otherwise, and his cooperation with the investigation ultimately factored into a somewhat lighter sentence than the one handed to Halden and Cassian themselves. Halden's motives, once fully examined, proved to be exactly as bitter and personal as his confession in the council chamber had suggested. He had served as an advisor to Draven's father for many years, and had harbored deep resentment when the elder Alpha named his son as successor, rather than considering Halden's own preferred candidate, a distant relative, who Halden believed would have granted him far greater influence over the pack's future direction. Years of quiet resentment had eventually curdled into an active conspiracy, patiently planned and slowly executed, intended to weaken Draven enough that a challenge for leadership, orchestrated behind the scenes by Halden's allies, might succeed at the full moon gathering, where such challenges were traditionally permitted under old pack law. Cassian, it emerged, had been recruited specifically for his willingness to act decisively should subtler methods fail, exactly as he had nearly done during the council chamber confrontation. Both men were ultimately stripped of their positions and titles, their punishment determined through the pack's traditional council processes, a resolution that satisfied the demands of justice while avoiding the kind of chaotic upheaval that might have further destabilized the pack during an already tense period leading up to the important gathering. Throughout this period, Draven's health continued improving steadily, the counter-remedy Illyra's brother had provided, proving effective once properly prepared and administered under the physician's careful supervision. The tremor in his hands faded gradually, his strength returning day by day, and the heavy exhaustion that had shadowed him for weeks finally began lifting, replaced by the sharp, confident bearing Elira remembered from her very first glimpse of him crossing the courtyard on her second day at the estate. As the full moon gathering approached, now only days away, Draven summoned Elira to his study once more, though this meeting carried none of the tension or secrecy of their earlier conversations. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, and he greeted her with a warmth that felt entirely different from the guarded exhaustion she had first encountered weeks earlier. "I have been considering how best to properly acknowledge what you have done for me, and for this entire pack," he said, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "A simple word of thanks feels wholly inadequate given everything you risked." Elira shifted uncomfortably in her seat, still unused to such direct attention from someone of his position. "I only did what felt right," she said honestly. "I could not stand by and watch you weaken without saying something, regardless of how frightened I was that no one would believe me. That courage is precisely why I intend to offer you a new position within this household," Draven continued, "one that reflects both your evident intelligence and the trust you have already earned. I would like you to serve as a personal advisor within my council, someone whose judgment I have already tested under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and found to be entirely reliable." Elira stared at him in stunned silence, the offer so far beyond anything she had ever imagined for herself that she struggled to fully comprehend it. A position among the king's council, a role reserved traditionally for experienced nobles and seasoned advisors, offered now to a maid who had arrived at Draven Hollow with nothing more than a small bag and a letter of recommendation barely anyone remembered writing. "I do not know what to say," she finally managed, her voice unsteady with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. "Say only that you accept," Draven replied, a genuine smile finally breaking through the last remnants of his earlier exhaustion, the first true smile she had seen from him since her arrival weeks earlier. "This pack owes you a debt it can never fully repay, but allowing your voice to be heard properly, rather than dismissed simply because of your position, feels like a fitting place to begin." Elira accepted, her heart swelling with an emotion she could not fully name, gratitude and relief, and something else entirely, a quiet pride in having stood firm through weeks of fear and uncertainty, refusing to let silence protect her comfort, while a king she barely knew walked blindly into danger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, in her new role, within a pack still healing from the wounds of betrayal, she faced them now not as an unremarkable maid hoping to disappear into the background, but as someone whose courage had already changed the course of an entire pack's future. Proof enough that even the quietest voice, when speaking truth, could matter more than anyone ever expected. The morning of the full moon gathering arrived clear and bright, the estate grounds bustling with final preparations as representatives from neighboring packs began arriving throughout the day, their carriages and escorts filling the courtyard that Elira had once crossed quietly, with armfuls of linens, unnoticed and unremarkable. Now she moved through those same grounds with a different kind of purpose, dressed in finer clothing than she had ever owned, her new role as advisor, granting her a place among the estate's most trusted staff, rather than its most easily overlooked. She watched from a position near the gathering hall as Draven greeted the visiting alphas one by one, his bearing strong and confident, every trace of the tremors and exhaustion that had plagued him for weeks, now fully gone. The physician had confirmed his complete recovery just days earlier, the wolfsbane ash finally flushed entirely from his system through the counter-remedy, and weeks of careful treatment. And standing before the assembled leaders of neighboring packs, he appeared every bit the strong, capable Alpha King his father had once believed him destined to become. Word of Haldan's betrayal had spread beyond Draven Hollow's walls by then, carried through the usual channels of gossip and diplomatic correspondence that flowed between allied packs, and Elira noticed the visiting alphas regarding Draven with a new kind of respect as the gathering proceeded, impressed not only by his evident strength, but by how swiftly and decisively he had handled such a dangerous internal threat. During a brief pause in the day's formal proceedings, one of the visiting alphas, an older woman named Bryn, who led a territory to the north, approached Elira directly, having apparently heard something of the story that had unfolded within Draven Hollow's walls. "I understand you are the one responsible for uncovering the conspiracy against your king," she said, studying Elira with evident curiosity. "It takes considerable courage to speak difficult truths to those with power over you, particularly when others around you seem determined not to listen." Elira considered the question carefully before answering. "I nearly stayed silent more than once," she admitted honestly. It would have been easier, certainly safer, to simply forget what I overheard and continue with my ordinary duties. But I kept thinking of what might happen if I said nothing, and found I could not live with that possibility. Bryn nodded approvingly. That kind of thinking, weighing the cost of silence against the cost of speaking, is rarer than it should be, particularly among those who fear losing what little security they hold. Your king is fortunate to have found such loyalty in an unexpected place. As the gathering continued into the evening, culminating in the traditional ceremonies held beneath the full moon itself, Illyra found a quiet moment to stand near the edge of the courtyard, watching the assembled packs and their leaders beneath the bright silver light overhead. The estate that had once felt so intimidating and unfamiliar during her first days now felt different entirely, not because the walls or gardens had changed, but because her place within them had transformed so completely. Draven found her there eventually, slipping away briefly from the formal proceedings to join her at the courtyard's edge. His expression relaxed in a way she had rarely seen from him during those tense early weeks of overheard conversations and hidden fears. "The gathering proceeds well," he said, following her gaze toward the assembled crowd. "No challenges have been raised against my leadership, and several alphas have already expressed interest in strengthening our existing alliances rather than testing them. Whatever Halden hoped to achieve through his betrayal, it seems to have accomplished the opposite of his intentions entirely." Illyra smiled at this, a genuine warmth settling over her, as she considered how completely the danger that had once threatened everything now lay fully behind them. "Perhaps that is simply what happens when the truth finally comes to light," she said. "Whatever darkness someone tries to hide within it eventually loses its power once it can no longer remain hidden." Draven turned to look at her directly, his expression thoughtful. "I have been considering something else as well," he said. "Beyond your role as advisor, I find myself grateful for more than simply the information you provided. Your presence throughout these difficult weeks, your steady courage, even when everything around you suggested silence would be the wiser choice. It has meant more to me than I think I properly expressed during the chaos of exposing Halden's plot." Illyra felt her cheeks warm slightly under his direct gaze, though she held his eyes steadily, rather than looking away, as she might once have done, during her earlier days, as an unremarkable maid, too afraid to be noticed. "I am simply glad I could help," she said honestly. "Glad that you listened, even when believing me meant questioning people you had trusted for years." "That trust is not so easily won anymore," Draven admitted, a wry note entering his voice. "But perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing. A king who questions too little leaves himself vulnerable to exactly the kind of betrayal I nearly suffered. You taught me that, whether you intended to or not." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the full moon gathering continue beneath the bright night sky, the estate's grounds filled with the sounds of celebration and diplomatic conversation, rather than the fearful whispers that had once dominated Illyra's every waking thought. The danger that had shadowed Draven Hollow for weeks had finally lifted entirely, replaced by a stability that felt all the stronger for having survived such a serious test. In the months that followed, Illyra settled fully into her new role as advisor, her insights and steady judgment proving valuable to Draven again and again, as the pack continued rebuilding trust and strengthening its position among its allies. She never forgot those early weeks of fear and uncertainty, of standing alone against a conspiracy no one else seemed willing to believe existed, but she carried that memory now, not as a source of lingering anxiety, but as proof of what a single determined voice could accomplish, even against overwhelming odds. No one believed the Maid when she first said the Alpha King was in danger, but she had refused to let that disbelief silence her, choosing instead to gather proof, to speak truth even when it terrified her, and to stand firm until the danger she alone had recognized was finally, fully exposed to the light. And because of that quiet, stubborn courage, a king who might otherwise have walked blindly into betrayal, lived instead to lead his pack forward, stronger and wiser than before. With a trusted advisor by his side, who understood better than anyone the true cost of silence, and the far greater power found in speaking up, before it became too late.